All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to Straight Science. This is an evening science presentation series put on by UAF Northwest Campus in Nome and UAF, University of Alaska Fairbanks, Alaska Sea Grant, also here in Nome. And tonight you're in the home office. And we both Northwest Campus and Alaska Sea Grant, we are public servants of the Bering Strait region. We serve all peoples of the Bering Strait region, which is the homeland and waters of the Inupiaq, Yupik, and St. Lawrence Island Yupik peoples. So tonight's speaker is with NOAA, and they are with the race division. And I had to look it up, to be honest, because I was like, oh, in case someone asks, race division. Race division stands for the Resource Assessment, I got to read it, and Conservation Engineering. So what? That is the group of the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, NOAA Fisheries, that actually does the research on the fish. Now, there's a whole lot of different research projects, and they even say on their website they do studies and research on commercially important fish. But they also do studies to learn about Alaska's marine ecosystems, and this is the group that does that. They are looking, the Bottom Trawl survey looks at, for us, the whole ecosystem, what's going on the sea floor. So we're going to hear the results of that. And to be honest, the results they're giving us tonight, we are the first ones to hear any of the results. So Race Division has gone out of their way over the course of years. They first came up in 2010. Then they took a break. Then they've been back since 2017. And with the information they catch on they collect on the water temperatures and all the numbers of fish and crab and everything else, that is really how we've really been monitoring since 2017 all that's happened, the ups and downs, the swings of the fish and crab and other important sea animals like tunicates or upa. All of that is from this group, and they are really into the research of fish. The people on these ships, it's always impressive to me. I send them pictures of what you all send me, and boom, they are right on it. And our speaker tonight is one of the guys who he's fabulous, giving us, on Gamble, someone sent in a picture of a squid recently, a prow fish, and they're right on it. I couldn't identify right down to the minutia there that they're able to, and they are really knowledgeable in the resource. So tonight's speaker is Duane Stevenson. He is the lead research biologist for their Bering Sea bottom trawl survey. And since they're talking to us up here, they're giving us the results of the Northern Bering Sea bottom trawl survey that they did this summer. And I think we'll let, that's enough of me yakking. We better let Duane get going. So with that, Duane, thank you so much for coming, and take it away. We're really glad you're here.
Thank you, Gay, and thanks to the UAF Northwest Campus for the invite. Really appreciate this series in general, and the fact that we're invited to this series every year to present the results of our research. Is the audio still okay and the visual still okay?
Yep, everything looks great. We're seeing your first title slide.
Excellent. So as Gay mentioned, we primarily perform our major research activities are performing bottom trawl surveys in the Bering Sea. I'm the lead of the team that does those bottom trawl surveys. I've been doing bottom trawl surveys in the Bering Sea for 22 years now. And I first want to acknowledge the team that helps me put together these documents. Our community highlights document that Gay will share a link to later, and who helped produce this slideshow and our data reports. All of the documents that come out of this research are primarily prepared by this team. So I want to thank them and recognize their contribution to all of this. So today, I'm here to basically give you the results of our 2023 survey of the Northern Bering Sea region, with information from the survey of the Eastern Bering Sea region as well, which I think you folks primarily think of as the Southern Bering Sea. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we conducted the survey this year. I'm going to talk about our charter vessels, the vessels that we use to do that survey, and the gear that we use, and then results. Most of you folks are here to hear the results, hear what we found in terms of the physical oceanographic data that we collect, the distribution, size, composition, abundance of the species that you're all interested in. And then, of course, every year we do a bunch of special research projects along with the standard surveys. And I want to talk a little bit about some of those as well. As Gabe was mentioning in the introduction, our primary goal with these surveys is primarily ecosystem monitoring. We are interested in tracking the movement of fishes, of crabs, of all of the what we call the benthic invertebrates, or invertebrates and fishes that live on the seafloor or near the seafloor, so that we can track changes in what's happening with the food web. Sometimes you hear the term ecosystem-based fisheries management. Our agency and primarily agencies around the world, I think, now are interested in not managing individual species so much, but being good stewards of the ecosystem in general, and that's what we're trying to do with these surveys. We do provide a lot of this information for stock assessment. The species that are commercially important and managed in the region use a lot of our information on population size, age structures of populations, genetic makeup of populations for those species. So that's an important use of our data as well. And then increasingly, what we're really spending a lot more time and effort doing is monitoring the environment itself. Um, we can't really learn a whole lot about what's causing the changes in the populations that we're seeing without um, measuring some of the variables in the environment in which they're living. So we measure water temperature, we measure, are increasingly measuring things like salinity and light. And I'll talk about a couple of new projects this year in which we're measuring additional um, oceanographic variables that we hope will tell us more about what these species are doing and why. And then the reason that we started, surveying up in the Bering Sea, Northern Bering Sea again recently was, as you all know, there has been a pretty dramatic loss of seasonal sea ice in the Bering Sea, and this is a major concern for everyone, and it was a concern for us as well. So we started doing bottom trawl surveys in the Northern Bering Sea when it became evident that that was a problem, and that initiative really got started in 2017. So this year, we did what we consider two separate bottom trawl surveys. Our Eastern Bering Sea bottom trawl survey, which we have been doing every year since 1982. So this was the 41st year of that survey. Um, those are the dots in the area down here below in the sort of darker gray region here. And we've been sampling these same stations, these same 376 stations every year since 1982, with the exception of 2020. That survey this year, like every year in the past, has starts right around the end of May, beginning of June, and runs through the beginning of August. What I'm going to primarily talk about today, though, is the Northern Bering Sea survey, and those are the dots up here in this lighter gray shaded area. This is the sixth year in recent times that we have completed this survey. As I mentioned, we started doing it what was originally envisioned as a biennial survey in 2017, and have been kind of coming up to some extent pretty much every year since then. This part of the survey area consists of 144 stations. We only were able to sample 116 of those stations this year. We had a couple of major medical situations on our vessels that caused us to lose a number of charter days. So there were a number of stations, particularly in the southern part of the region, that we weren't able to get samples from this year. And that survey this year, as in previous years, generally runs from the end of July to mid to late August. And the timing this year was no different. The vessels that we use have been pretty consistent over the years. Before this year, we had been using the same two vessels for over 10 years. The Alaska Knight we used again this year. This was the 12th year that we've used that vessel. It's been a great platform for us. In the past, we have used the Vester Allen in recent years, but we switched boats this year to the Northwest Explorer. We had new contracts out, but the Northwest Explorer worked out very well for us as well. And we're hoping that we'll be able to keep these two boats for at least the next several years to continue doing these surveys. For those of you who haven't seen it or heard about it before, we use a bottom trawl called the 83112 Eastern Trawl. It is basically it's called the 83112 because the top rope or the head rope is 83 feet long and the bottom rope or foot rope is 112 feet long. That generally means that the net opening when it's on the bottom is about 50 feet. We towed the net for 30 minutes at 3 knots in a typical standard tow, and then we measure the net width and the distance fished, and that's how we end up with the amount of effort that's expended for each tow. So before I start talking about 2023, I just give you a brief recap of what we saw last year in 2022. For the past several years, which have been relatively warm in the Bering Sea, we didn't see much of what we call the cold pool. 2022 was the year that the cold pool kind of came back to the Eastern Bering Sea. So temperatures, although they had been our mean annual temperatures, which I'll show you in a minute, had been relatively warm, they kind of came back to average last year. With that, we found that our overall fish biomass that we found in the Northern Bering Sea was down to not quite down to previous sort of cold year levels, but it was definitely down last year. And then so the question became, when the cold pool has come back, are the southern species that were inhabiting the Northern Bering Sea for the past few years, were they departing, and would we start seeing Arctic species returning again? So hopefully I can answer some of those questions today. This is one of the data products that we produce on a regular basis now when we're doing Bering Sea surveys. Each time we put the net in the water, there's a thermometer on it. We measure the bottom temperature and we measure the surface temperature. And for each one of those hauls, we then, at the end of the day, send those surface temperatures and the bottom temperatures back to Seattle. Then we have some folks in Seattle who then populate these maps with those temperatures in nearly real time, the day after, or sometimes 2 or 3 days after. But in this way, we can notify the public of where we are, what we're doing, and what those temperature data look like in almost real time. And that's been a pretty popular data product for us. We have a lot of people that are paying attention to this now. And so we're going to continue to provide that product in the coming years. I call this the March of the Temperature plot. Okay, so what do we see in 2023? Well, as I mentioned, we take a bottom temperature measurement and a surface temperature measurement at each one of those hauls, and we use those temperature measurements to produce these sort of temperature surface maps that you see here. As I mentioned in some of the previous warm years, this cold pool, which you can see as this dark area of cold water here, what we saw was a major shrinkage of that cold pool over the past several warm years. In fact, in 2019, there really wasn't any cold pool at all to speak of. And then in 2022, as I mentioned, that cold pool came back. So we saw some really cold water extending down along the Eastern Bering Sea, almost into Bristol Bay. And in 2023, we saw basically the same thing. We saw another cold pool extending all the way down into the southern part of the Bering Sea. And the difference this year was, although we had a return to the cold pool last year, we had a cold pool of relatively similar overall area this year. So it covered about the same amount of area as 2022. But as you can see, there's a lot more of these really dark blue, almost black, which is really cold temperatures, below zero temperatures. And we saw a lot more really cold water this year than we did last year. So the overall extent of that cold pool of water was the same, but it was the water itself was actually colder this year than last year. If we look at the surface temperatures, we see a similar pattern, only we saw even a more dramatic area of relatively cold water on the surface, particularly in Bristol Bay and up toward Nunivak Island, that we haven't really seen much of in recent years. So overall, definitely not a warm year. Again, like last year, we are definitely moving back toward the overall long-term mean in terms of the overall temperature regime of the region. So this is the long-term trend of annual mean temperatures. What we do is we take a temperature measurement from each of those bottom trawls, each of those toes, and then we put all those together to produce an annual single mean temperature throughout the survey area. And we do that for the Eastern Bering Sea, which is the figure on the left here, and then the Northern Bering Sea on the right. And so what we can see from the Eastern Bering Sea is that this year is the first time in quite some time where we've had temperatures both at the surface and on the bottom that were actually slightly below what we consider the long-term mean. So we're out of that sort of area or that time period of really, really warm temperatures and back toward not what we would call a cold year, but more like an average overall year. And then obviously in the Northern Bering Sea, we don't have as long a time series and it's more interrupted, but the bottom temperature in the Northern Bering Sea was just a little bit cooler than last year as well. Although I would say they were pretty much very similar between last year and this year. We talk about the cold pool quite a bit, and that the cold pool is that area of or that mass of really cold water that's left behind when the sea ice melts out of the Bering Sea. And so that cold pool area, we think, can act as a barrier to species migration from south to north. We definitely see distributions of fishes uh, that are to some extent, I guess, organized around that cold pool, where there are a lot more fish outside of that cold pool than inside the cold pool. And as I mentioned before, the cold pool in 2023 was about the same size as last year, almost exactly the same size, actually. But these really cold temperatures, the darker blues down here, you can see that there was actually an increase in those areas between 2022 and 2023. So although what we consider the cold pool um, in general usage, which is the area of water that's 2 degrees C or less, the really cold water that we think is actually a more important barrier, biological barrier for fish distributions, the area of water that's 0 degrees and less, that area was actually greater this year than last year. Just to throw a few numbers at you to impress you with all the work that we've done, I guess, this summer. Uh, in the course of the Northern Bering Sea survey, which was again 116 stations this year, we collected almost 35,000 length records for various species of fishes, compared with almost 140,000 in the Eastern Bering Sea, which again is a much larger survey, 376 stations this year. We collected about 1,300 otoliths. We use those for aging fish species in the Northern Bering Sea, and then also over 1,000 stomach samples. We have a whole group in the Seattle office that looks at stomach contents and builds food webs and gets food web information from those stomach contents. So we were very busy this year collecting a lot of samples. Okay, so now I want to go through the overall individual species results, and the way that I've tried to organize those this year is we have some species that have looks like they have increased in overall biomass in the Northern Bering Sea between 2022 and 2023, and we have some species that are relatively very similar or almost the same, and then we have some species that have clearly declined since last year. So first, I'm going to talk about the good news, the species whose numbers have increased in the Northern Bering Sea over the last year. And I'm going to show you a lot of slides that look like this. There's a lot of information on these slides. We try to pack a lot in here. There's a lot of information to get across, so sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming. But on all these slides are organized in the same way, so the same information is in the same place. So in the upper left here, we have the distribution maps for 2022 and 2023. So you can compare where we found the species between this year and last year in both the Northern Bering Sea and the Eastern Bering Sea. For species that we took length data from, we're showing length distributions. Showing length distributions is interesting because we can get a look at sometimes year classes in the populations, try to figure out whether we're seeing adults or juveniles and that sort of thing. So that length distribution information can be really helpful. And then down here in the lower left, we have the long-term trends in biomass, which is just the overall weight of the population that we're sampling in the Eastern Bering Sea and in the Northern Bering Sea. And then the numbers that we've seen relative to the mean in the lower right hand corner. And so I'm going to start with saffron cod. I believe the local name for this is tom cod. important species I know for many uh, of the local inhabitants of the region. And in general, this is part of the good news that we're seeing. Although we didn't really see much of a change in distribution this year between 2022 and 2023, it looks like the overall biomass is actually going back up. And in 2 years ago, we saw a really, really low biomass of saffron cod. But it looks like over the past 2 years, we're moving in the right direction again, and the biomass for the Northern Bering Sea is moving back toward the long-term mean. Still not anywhere close to what we were seeing in the warm years, 2017 and 2019, but definitely more this year than last year. Sea peaches, I know there are folks up there that are interested in sea peaches as well. That's more good news. In fact, we found sea peaches at several more stations this year than we found them last year. It looks like last year we only found them in 2 or 3 stations in the Northern Bering Sea survey area, but a lot more stations. We saw sea peaches this year, and that biomass number almost 10 times the biomass that we saw last year. We saw this year in the Northern Bering Sea. So good news for sea peaches. There seems to be more of those out there this year. Capelin is kind of a hit or miss species for us. They're pelagic, so our net doesn't do a great job at catching them. And I'll say that about a number of species I'm going to talk about tonight. But in general, like the sea peaches, we saw a big increase in biomass this year in the Northern Bering Sea, 5 times as many this year as we saw last year. Those numbers are still relatively low, in particular in relationship to like the early teens in the Eastern Bering Sea. But again, it looks like the trend is moving in the right direction, and we're seeing more capelin this year than we saw last year. And then there actually looks like there are a couple of relatively high density tows that we found as well in the Northern Bering Sea. One not too far outside of Nome. Nivasuk, I believe, is the word that Gay has told me, the local word that's used for the snail fishes. And it's important for me to point out here that when we talk about snail fishes here, I'm talking about a group of several different species. We know there are probably at least 3 or 4 different species of snail fishes in the Northern Bering Sea. We kind of lump them all together because they're really difficult to identify in the field. Um, and the species level differences may or may not be important for the ecological trend in the individual species. But like the past couple of species I've talked about, we see a positive trend for snail fishes. So this year and last year we've seen increases in the numbers that we're catching in the Northern Bering Sea. Now those are increases from a really, really low number that we saw in 2021, and we're also seeing the same thing in the Eastern Bering Sea, where the snailfish populations we seem to be at least seeing more of them over the past couple of years. Jellyfishes we find everywhere, everywhere in the Northern Bering Sea, everywhere essentially in the Eastern Bering Sea. We always get a lot of jellyfishes. And this year we got our biomass estimate for jellyfishes in the Northern Bering Sea is up almost double, well, actually a little more than double what we found last year, this dot here. And again, this is a complex of several different species of jellyfishes, most of which are pictured here on the upper right. And then you can also see that we found some relatively higher densities of jellyfishes just to the north of St. Lawrence Island here in the northeast of St. Lawrence Island. And the news for crabs is actually pretty good for the Northern Bering Sea. Um, I don't know how meaningful this increase is in the Northern Bering Sea. You can see these error bars here. These error bars just indicate the amount of uncertainty we have in the biomass estimate for these species. So the bigger the error bars, the more uncertain that estimate is. And what that generally means when you have really big error bars is most of the individuals that you caught were just in a few toes. Whereas if you have a species where you catch a similar number in all the hauls you do, that error bar will be very small. But nonetheless, it looks like we saw an increase in red king crab biomass this year relative to last year, but almost exactly the same as what we saw in 2021. And as in previous years, we see this Norton Sound and areas adjacent to Norton Sound distribution for the red king crabs. We always seem to find them in the same places. And occasionally we see them in slightly higher densities, like you see with this little darker dot here. It's interesting here in this length frequency distribution that it looks like we saw a lot of small ones here. Those are probably about 20 to 25 millimeters carapace length, so they're really small guys. Uh, I have no idea how, I'm not a crab biologist, so I have no idea how old those crabs might be. But this is promising to see a big group of little things coming into the population here in the Northern Bering Sea. And in the blue king crab, you'll notice the distribution is almost exactly the opposite of the red king crab. Most of you probably already know this. And the news is good for, cautiously optimistic for blue king crab as well. We saw a similar increase in blue king crab as we saw in red king crab this year. Um, Still seeing really low numbers of both blue and red king crab in the eastern Bering Sea, but the blue king crab numbers are at least slightly positive in the northern Bering Sea this year. And as you can see up here in the 2023 distribution, the high density or relatively high density populations of blue king crabs were here on the western end of St. Lawrence Island. No, it doesn't look like we saw any big influx of the smaller specimens in the blue king crab as we did in the red king crab. Urchins, uh, urchins. We saw some high density areas of urchins again up here on the east or the west and the northwest side of St. Lawrence Island. And what that resulted in was a 21% increase from last year. And especially since 2021, the numbers of urchins that we have been encountering in the Northern Bering Sea have gone way up. And you'll see the distribution is very similar for 2022 as for 2023, where we're seeing the big toes of urchins are along that northwest coast of St. Lawrence Island. This is actually a photo from 2017. We haven't seen any hulls like that lately, but we can see them in high densities some places. Rainbow smelt. This is a tough species for us to assess because it's a very coastal species, and we do very few hauls within 3 miles of the land. So large parts of their populations are outside of our survey area. So we always need to interpret our numbers for species like rainbow smelt with some caution. But it looks like the number and the distribution is relatively similar this year as it was in 22, except maybe a little further south than what we saw in 2022. It looks like we saw a big uh, high density population of rainbow smelt in Norton Sound last year, whereas this year it was a little bit further south. Okay, so those were the species for which we saw some pretty good increases in the past year. Now there are a group of species that we feel like have pretty similar, or essentially holding steady. And I'm kind of defining that here as anything plus or minus 10% of what we saw last year. Those, when the numbers are that similar, plus or minus 10%, we're not really sure how real they are and how much of that is variability in what we're catching. So here's the only skate that we see in the Northern Bering Sea, the Alaska skate, holding steady. We see a very broad size distribution of skates, these skates in the Northern Bering Sea, very similar to what we see in the Eastern Bering Sea. And in the high density areas, generally these sort of inner to middle regions south of St. Lawrence Island is where we tend to see most of those. Holding steady in the Northern Bering Sea, but down from the warm years of 2017 and 2019. And we're actually seeing somewhat of a decline in the past few years in the Eastern Bering Sea as well. But we still see this species all over the place. Alaska plaice, important species for a lot of reasons. We see big concentrations of plaice to the south, in particular of St. Lawrence Island. And essentially our estimate for the population this year is exactly the same as it was last year. And it looks like the length frequency distribution is very similar this year as it was last year as well. So the distribution is similar, the length distribution is similar, and the biomass, it looks like, is very similar. What I call the find them everywhere or ubiquitous sea star, we call them the purple orange sea star. Again, we see them everywhere in the Bering Sea, in the shallow water, particularly in coastal regions. They can be very, very abundant in the eastern and the northern Bering Sea. And this is another species where we found them everywhere again this year. We found them everywhere last year. We've found them everywhere in previous years. So no meaningful change, we don't think, in the overall abundance and populations of purple orange sea stars. I'm going to talk about a couple of different species of sculpins today. These are the large-headed benthic bottom-dwelling fishes that have spiny heads. And we see a fair number of those throughout the Bering Sea. This is one species that we tend to see more of in the eastern Bering Sea than in the northern Bering Sea. Um, and this is a species that we used to think of as a quote unquote cold pool species. So a species that was more common in areas where that really cold water was. And so when we see the cold water start to return to the northern Bering Sea, we're kind of expecting those populations to eventually start to rebound. Um, we haven't really quite seen that yet, any evidence of that yet. And that species, as far as we can tell from 2022 to 2023, is holding steady. Everybody wants to know about pollock and cod. These are the two species that were really responsible for the influx of fish biomass into the northern Bering Sea during those really warm years. 2017 and 2019, we saw big spikes of populations of pollock and cod in the northern Bering Sea. Those big populations of cod, both cod and pollock, have in large part disappeared from the northern Bering Sea since those really warm years. We're not seeing the big densities, the big populations of pollock and cod anymore in the northern Bering Sea that we once did. And essentially, the number of pollock that we saw this year was almost identical to the number of pollock that we saw last year. And this length distribution that we see pretty much every year in both the eastern and northern Bering Sea, we get these little guys, these age 1 year old individuals that are about 10 to 15 centimeters long. And then we get the adults starting at about 42, 44 centimeters long as well. So it looks like the population in terms of juveniles versus adults is very similar in the northern Bering Sea as it is in the eastern Bering Sea. I will note, though, that there was a decline this year in the overall numbers of pollock in the eastern Bering Sea, similar to 2021. Okay, so that was the good and the potentially good news. Now we have a bunch of species here that it looks for which the biomass declined or decreased this year from last year. And one of the most important ones is halibut, of course. The distribution of halibut that we see in the eastern and northern Bering Sea tends to be very stable from year to year. From year to year, the only difference is how many we tend to see. And this year we saw a few less than last year. You see that these error bars again are pretty large, which means there's quite a bit of uncertainty around these estimates for the halibut populations in the northern Bering Sea. So we're not sure to what extent this decline is real, but there has been a decline in our overall number from this year or from last year to this year. So potentially, at least we caught a few less this year than we did last year. The whelks that we see in the northern Bering Sea are two species, and they tend to be slightly difficult to identify. So we group them together here as well. These are these big snails, really thick, heavy shells that we sometimes see in large numbers, at least in isolated areas. We see them in large numbers throughout the Bering Sea. The distribution of them, it looks like, is pretty similar in 2023 as it was in 2022, but it looks like we saw a big high density area of these whelks in the Norton Sound in 2022 that we didn't see this year. And maybe partially as a result of that, the overall biomass estimate has declined between last year and this year. And then we also see the same thing in the eastern Bering Sea, much fewer of these snails this year than we saw last year. Bering flounder, pretty similar this year to last year, both the eastern and the southern Bering or in the northern Bering Sea, a little bit lower, but again, these numbers are relatively similar from year to year. and we're not really seeing any big distribution or big high density areas of Bering flounder either last year or this year in the Northern Bering Sea. With the most areas, the most dense areas of Bering flounder that we tend to see are in this northwest region of our Eastern Bering Sea survey area right here, near the Russian border, and that's has been pretty stable from year to year. But this is another species where this year we see a relatively high proportion of the population are these little guys, 10-centimeter fish. So, maybe that's good news. Maybe that means there's a new year class recruiting a new year class of larvae that are settling down into the habitats in the northern part of the Bering Sea. It'll be interesting to see in future years if we see similar uh, group of fish just getting bigger, because that tends to be what we see when there's a year class that's really successful and there are a lot of individuals of larvae in one year settling out to the bottom in a particular area. What we'll tend to see is this peak of individuals keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger every year. So that's something that we'll be watching for in the future. The plain sculpin, similar to the shorthorn sculpin that I talked about before, except this tends to be a more southerly distributed species. So we see a lot of them in the Eastern Bering Sea, particularly in the shallow water. And the same thing happened again this year. But we have seen declines in the populations this year in both the Eastern and the Northern Bering Sea. Not real major declines, but 20 to 30%. This is one of those species, like I mentioned with the species I mentioned before, one of the smelts that's a really coastal species. Anytime we have a species that's in really shallow water, really close to the coast, there's a concern about how well we're sampling them, because we just don't do any tows that are really, really close to the coast in really shallow water. So it could be that in this year, a bigger proportion of that population, a larger number of those fish were inside our survey area here in the really shallow water, as opposed to last year when they were a little bit further out in deeper water. So we caught more of them last year than this year, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there were more of them last year than this year. And this is another example of that. Yellowfin sole is a species that we know the adults move inshore into really shallow water to spawn in the early summer, late spring and early summertime. And then after they spawn, they come back into the deeper water. And so depending on the temperature conditions each year, we may see a different proportion of the population in our survey area, because it looks like potentially in 2022, maybe that was uh, a little bit later in the spawning cycle for that species. So we see a lot of high density yellowfin sole areas right near the edge of our survey area. Whereas in this year, 2023, we didn't see those high density areas. Maybe that means that some of them were inside in the shallow water that we didn't get this year. But the result in terms of our survey area and our biomass estimate is that it looks like there's a decline in the population in both the Eastern Bering Sea and in the Northern Bering Sea. I talked a little bit about cod earlier, in that that's a species that we consider, along with walleye pollock, to be one of those really highly mobile species, um, large populations, big biomass that can go move all over the Bering Sea. And like pollock, we saw those big numbers of cod back in 2017 and 2019, and ever since then we've seen declining numbers of cod in the Northern Bering Sea. Interestingly, as this species has been declining in the Northern Bering Sea, the numbers have been getting slightly larger in the Eastern Bering Sea. And what this potentially means is that that's just the population moving north and south across that division line that we create between the Northern and the Eastern Bering Sea. And of course, we know from all of our satellite tagging data with cod that some of the cod that we tag and see in the Northern Bering Sea may travel really long distances. In fact, we've tagged a couple of cod in the Northern Bering Sea north of St. Lawrence Island that we know have swum all the way down into the Gulf of Alaska. So we know they do a lot of swimming and move all over the Bering Sea, between the spawning season in the winter, and the feeding season in the summer. So this is probably an indication when we see the numbers going up in the Eastern Bering Sea, when we see the numbers going down in the Northern Bering Sea, that there's probably some fluctuation in which side of the survey border those species are on. And then this is a case where we see several different year classes in the length frequency distribution. So these are probably 1 year olds, these are probably 2 or 3 year olds, and then these are older fish here. I think we've just got a few more here. Snow crab, you've probably all heard about snow crab lately because of this. Over the past few years, we've seen a steep decline in the number of snow crabs that we've been getting in the Eastern Bering Sea. Um, so major decline in that population. The Northern Bering Sea population, which is much smaller, tends to be relatively stable. We not see the huge declines in the Northern Bering Sea that we've seen in the Eastern Bering Sea, and the distribution has seemed pretty stable as well. But what this tells us is that the reason that we saw this huge decline in the Eastern Bering Sea is not because they were all moving to the Northern Bering Sea. This is one of the real advantages of us of trying to sample the entire Bering Sea, or as much of it as we can, is that we can rule out the possibility that all of these crabs from 2019 to 2021 just moved from the Eastern Bering Sea to the Northern Bering Sea, because it's clear that there's not a huge influx of snow crabs in the northern area, at least the northern area that we're able to sample. We don't see a whole lot of northern rock soles in the Northern Bering Sea, and one of the interesting things that we saw back in 2017 and 2019 was that there were a lot of little guys, a lot of little rock sole that we saw, particularly in this southern part of the Northern Survey area. So it looked like that there was a new year class of northern rock sole that was settling out in the Northern Bering Sea, and that was interesting. And we were able to follow that year class for the next few years in the Bering Sea, and that's probably what this is the remainder of that year class that we saw show up a few years ago. Interestingly, we see potentially another good year class of northern rock sole in the Northern Bering Sea this year. But despite this new influx of smaller individuals, we've seen a decline over the past couple of years in the overall population of northern rock sole in the Eastern Bering Sea. But again, this is a case where we see an increase in the Eastern Bering Sea and a decrease in the Northern Bering Sea. And what that probably tells us is that this population is just moving north and south a little bit over the years. Sea onions. I know everybody loves sea onions, but we sure don't see very many of them. Um, there was a big, it looks like basically back in 2010, the first modern survey in the Northern Bering Sea was a really banner year for sea onions. And you can see that here in the Eastern Bering Sea as well. 2010 was the peak of the sea onion abundance population in the Bering Sea. And ever since then, that population has been declining. So we see those strong declines over the past 10 or 15 years in the Eastern Bering Sea, and then we see the same thing in the Northern Bering Sea. And we're continuing to see fewer and fewer of those every year, it seems. And they're very patchy. We just don't see them very often in very many tows, and even when we do, they tend to be in relatively low numbers. Herring down this year, 89%, a lot, a big decline in the numbers of herring. But this is one of those species that's really pelagic. They tend to be up higher in the water column than our net fishes, so they can be really hit or miss in terms of how many of them we catch in the net. When we do catch them, we tend to get relatively, we get a school of them, um, but we don't see them in any really high densities in the Northern Bering Sea, um, and we haven't in a few years now. And so, this is another species that peaked in the Northern Bering Sea in one of the warm years, 2019, and it's kind of been we've been seeing fewer and fewer of them ever since. And I believe this is the last one. This is one of the, to me, the biggest head scratchers of the last couple of years in the Northern Bering Sea. We used to see some Arctic cod down in the southern part of the Bering Sea occasionally, particularly in those colder years, right around 2010. You can see we had some pretty big spikes in the Arctic cod populations in the Eastern Bering Sea. And then we also saw a lot of them in 2010 in the Northern Bering Sea. And of course, once the warm water started showing up in the Northern Bering Sea, cold pool disappeared. Arctic cod are an ice-associated species, so they tend to be associated with areas that are covered with ice for part of the year. We saw the Arctic cod essentially disappear from the Eastern Bering Sea and from the Northern Bering Sea. So I at least kind of expected that once we started seeing the cold pool return, once we started seeing some more sea ice, seasonal sea ice return to the Northern Bering Sea, we would start to see Arctic cod again. And that probably what was happening over the warm years is those populations were essentially just retreating through the Bering Strait into the Chukchi Sea in areas that were covered with ice for more of the year. But we haven't yet seen the return of the Arctic cod to the Bering Sea yet. Um, I don't know if there's just a time lag in those populations and their response to increasing ice cover, but it's sort of a mystery to me why we haven't seen them come back in the Northern Bering Sea yet. But we haven't, and this year we saw even fewer of them than before. And this number one here indicates that we are estimating that the entire biomass of Arctic cod in the Eastern Bering Sea is 1 metric ton, and that's probably rounded up. And what that probably means is that on the entire survey, we found one fish right up here near the near Saint Matthew Island. So not a lot of Arctic cod around. Okay, so hopefully I haven't bored you too much with all those species specific slides. And this is just a summary of everything that I just went over in terms of how much biomass we saw in 2023 for all of these species and how that relates to last year 2022. And uh, they are in order here of highest positive change to highest negative change. As I mentioned, there are a few species that we feel like uh, significantly increased in their population in the Northern Bering Sea. There are a few species down here near the bottom of this column and the top of this column that are relatively stable, and then there are a few species that have definitely declined. And I think that the overall take-home message here is that for these large biomass species, these species that are responsible for a lot of the energy flow through the Bering Sea ecosystem, the yellowfin sole, the cod, the pollock. For a lot of those high biomass species, it looks like those numbers are declining in the northern Bering Sea, getting back to the numbers that we saw before the really warm years. So as the cold pool is returning and some of the seasonal ice numbers coverage is returning to more normal levels in general, those species, those populations are retreating back southward toward the more southern part of the Bering Sea. But as I mentioned before, this Arctic cod thing is kind of still a mystery. Okay, so in addition to all this population level and biomass stuff and measuring lengths and pulling otoliths and all that other stuff, we do a huge number of special research projects every year in conjunction with partners all over the world, universities, other government institutions. Um, and there's just a lot of stuff going on out there. And so I put up a slide like this every year just so people can get sort of an inkling for all of the different kind of stuff that we're doing out there. And I'm not certainly not going to go over all of these, but I want to draw your attention to a few of the projects that we've done over the past several years, and then a couple of new things that we're doing this year. So in previous years, I've talked about these projects. I've talked about the fish condition work that we're doing. We are trying to get a handle on ways to measure the health of populations other than just the number of fish that are out there and the size of the fish that are out there. And one of the ways that we can do that is by trying to see what the overall condition of those fish is. So how much fat reserves do they have? How healthy are they? And that we do using this little tool over here, or one of the ways that we do that is using this tool here called a fat meter. And we can measure the amount of fat and lipids there in the liver and in the muscle tissue of the fish. And so that's something we've been doing for several years and have continued to do this year. And I'm hoping that sometime soon we'll start getting some good results out of that. As Gay is familiar with, we have been collecting individuals for harmful algal bloom sampling. I'm recalling that there was you guys had a pretty significant harmful algal bloom or an algal bloom scare earlier this summer. Um, and one of the sort of one of the ways that we can help track those algal blooms is by looking at the benthic invertebrates that collect those toxins. Our net is not great at collecting the individual species that tend to accumulate those toxins, the polychaete worms, the bivalve mollusks, the clams, and the cockles, and those sorts of things. But when we do get them, we hold on to them, and then we send them to Kathy Lefebvre or Gay so that they can do some toxin sampling on them. So we've continued to do that this year. And then also, as I mentioned a little bit earlier at the beginning of the slideshow, we're getting a lot of increased interest in the environmental variables that we're seeing in the ocean. We've all heard by now that the oceans of the world are becoming more acidic as they absorb more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and so we know that lowers the pH in ocean waters. So one of the things that we're really trying to do is to get up to speed on the instrumentation to measure those pH levels, both at the surface and then all the way down to the bottom, like we do with temperature. So we started some experimentation with that this year, and then also we'd like to eventually measure dissolved oxygen and dissolved oxygen profiles through the water column, so that we can get an idea of what the oxygen conditions are like throughout the water column, throughout the Bering Sea, because we're one of the few groups that samples throughout the Bering Sea in the summertime. So those are things that we've done in the past and we're continuing to do now. But there are also a couple of things that we just started this year. You'll all remember, I hope, or most of you will remember, that we have spent the past few years putting these satellite tags on Pacific cod. And that has been great because we have learned a lot about Pacific cod movement. And one of the most important things that we've learned is that Pacific cod swim a long way between the summertime when we catch them in the Northern Bering Sea and the wintertime when they're spawning. They move a lot. And so we've partnered this year with the Bering Sea Fisheries Research Foundation and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game to start putting some of these same satellite tags on red king crab in Bristol Bay. And of course, tracking the movements of species like king crab and others can tell us a lot of things about what they're doing, when they're doing it, can give us information about where they are in times of the year when we're not sampling. Our bottom trawl survey is only in the summertime, so we have really good information about where these species are from the end of May through the end of August. However, the rest of the year, we're not up there. We're not seeing where these species are. And so we don't know really how far king crabs migrate. So this is one of the things that we're trying to look at with this particular project. We put a lot of tags on crab this year. We tagged over 100 red king crabs in this Bristol Bay area. So we should start getting data back soon on them. The tags were set to release. The first batch was October. So just last month. I haven't seen any of those data yet, but we should have some at this point. And in January and April, we'll get more information from those tags popping up. So hopefully in future years, we'll be able to say more about what the movement of king crabs looked like, as we have been able to do with Pacific cod. The other thing that's become very clear that we need to start doing is modernizing our survey. The bottom trawl survey that we're doing, that we did this year, is exactly the same in most meaningful ways as the bottom trawl survey that we did in the region in 1982, and in fact in the late 70s. Our gear was designed back then, the survey was designed back then, and it was a great survey back then. It doesn't necessarily fit what we're trying to accomplish today, the goals that we're trying to accomplish today. So we are embarking on a long-term project to modernize our overall survey. The reasons for that are many, but the primary ones are the footprint. So we don't do just one Bering Sea survey. I'm talking about two separate surveys, the Northern Bering Sea survey, the Eastern Bering Sea survey. We also do a Bering Slope survey, or we have in the past. So we're covering a single mass of water with three separate surveys that can become prey to different funding variability, I should say, and don't really match the distributions of the species that we're sampling. And I've mentioned that before, when we see species going back and forth between the Northern Bering Sea research area and the Eastern Bering Sea research area. So what we'd like to do is design one survey that combines all those areas. We'd like to be able to expand our effort in those areas. The survey that we have now is very rigid, very inflexible survey design, and we'd like to make it more flexible so we can deal with emerging issues in a better and more efficient way. And our gear is obsolete. And what I mean by obsolete is not that it's old. What I mean is that it's not used. The trawl that we use is not used by anyone else in the world. So the trawl doors are not used by anyone in the industry. The nylon web that we use is not used by anyone in the industry. The floats, and what that means is they're really hard for us to source and they're really expensive. And as they get more and more expensive and less available, that becomes a threat to the survey. So we need to update our gear to modern commercial standards so that it's more available to us. So this year we started doing some testing. In summer of 23, we tried some new trawl doors. We're trying some trawling comparisons with different gear on the shelf and the slope, trying different trawl durations, all of these things, because eventually when we change over to this new survey, we're going to have a lot of calibration experiments, and we're going to have a lot of comparison, side by side comparisons with different gears, using different towing um, methods and different towing areas. So it's a really time consuming endeavor that we think is going to take us several years. So really got started on it this last year. What is the take home message for the folks in the northern Bering Sea and the Bering Strait region? Well, what that probably means is that over the next few years, we're going to be reducing our sampling frequency and footprint in the northern Bering Sea. With our current levels of resources and manpower, we just can't do all of this modernization work and all of the survey work that we've been doing over the past couple of years. So something is going to have to give way there, and what that potentially means is that we will re-envision the Northern Bering Sea survey in the way it was originally intended, which is a biennial survey in odd years only. So there's potential that if we decide to go this direction, there will be no Northern Bering Sea coverage in 2024 and 2026. But the payoff for that is going to be that when we redesign this whole survey, it's going to include the Eastern Bering Sea, the Northern Bering Sea, and the whole area. So we hope to resume full annual coverage on an every year basis around 2027. And we're hoping that survey will fit the needs of the goals that we want to accomplish much better than our current survey, and it will be more efficient and cheaper to do, so that we don't have to worry so much about the funding from year to year. I want to put in a plug for the ways that you can access our data. All of our data from this year are available online already, and there are several different ways that you can get those data and learn about what we're doing. Our general data products are here. Um, we have a mapping tool here that you can use to actually map out the data, map out where we found all the fishes and invertebrates. And then if there's specific data that you want to request from us, there's a place that you can do that as well. We put these QR codes in here so that hopefully you can look through this talk at some point later, or look through the community report and access those things directly through your phone or your mobile device, which we know is what people are doing these days. All right, so take home messages. 2023, very similar to 2022 in terms of the overall temperature regime. The cold pool is back. It's still there, but this year it was colder than in 2022. Similar in size, but colder this year than it was in 2022. What we're seeing for at least most of the high biomass fish species is that their overall populations in the Northern Bering Sea are continuing to decline from their peak populations back in the really warm years, 2017, 2019. And we expect that because we're seeing colder water. However, along with that, we're also seeing increases in many of the invert populations. The sea urchins are a good example of that, and we expect this too as the Northern Bering Sea becomes colder, becomes more like the Arctic system that it used to be. We know that in general, Arctic marine systems are dominated by benthic invertebrates. So invertebrate populations that live on the bottom tend to be most of the biomass in the system. That system kind of got turned upside down when the water got really warm in the Northern Bering Sea, and we saw lots of those um, large biomass species like cod and pollock that are up in the water column sort of invade the Northern Bering Sea region. Now that the water is getting a little bit colder, we see those populations migrating south again, and the invert populations tend to be doing better. And as I mentioned before, all of our survey results are available now. We have printed out many copies of our community report. I was hoping that they would arrive in Nome by today, but Gay tells me that they aren't quite there yet. Thanks, Postal Service. But they should be available soon. And we sent them to a number of folks in the region. And I believe that Gay has the URL for the online version of that community report. If you could post that in the chat, Gay, when you get a chance, that would be great. Otherwise, I can do it later. But this report, the online version of it, is available now. You can download the PDF. You can look at it through your web browser. It's all out there. And oh yeah, and here are the QR codes for that. If you want, we have the 2023 Community Highlights Report has already printed and ready and available online. And then also our final data report from 2022 is out as well. The data report for this year, the uh, the full report with all of the tables and walls of text and everything will be coming out hopefully the early part of next year. And with that, I just want to say thanks again to UAF, and thanks to Gay for inviting us to give these talks every year. It's a great chance for us to get the information out and interact with the folks who are interested in this information and who are using this information. Special thanks to the Bering Strait communities and organizations and all the folks in Nome that helped us out this year with logistics, with questions, with submitting photos. All of that's really interesting information, and we thank you all for it. This survey is the work of scores of people. I think there was something like 35 or 40 total people that were actually on the boat this year, and many others that support us from land. So I want to thank all of those folks, and in particular, again, the folks that I showed photos of at the beginning that prepared this slideshow, as well as all the documents that we've been giving you links to. Their help is invaluable, and they continue to impress me every day. So thanks. Be happy to take questions if there's time and interest.
All right. You might want to leave. Yeah, you know what? You might stop share or leave it as is with your slides up. People may want to go back to that. So while you're all thinking, I see you, Charlie. While you're all thinking of your questions, I know I've got a bunch, and wonderful presentation, lovely graphics, I have to say, and very informative. So while you're thinking of your questions, everyone, this is the time you write in and show some love for Duane Stevenson or the NOAA Race Division, because it's never easy to be a straight science speaker, a public speaker of any time. I can guarantee you that, without getting the butterflies in your stomach and all that. So it's nice to get a little kudos for the speaker. And I guess while that's going on, Charlie, take it away.
Okay, thanks. I'm always terribly impressed, and I really do value these reports and the data. And you just gave us a gem with the red king crab apparent recruitment coming on. That's wonderful news. Had a couple of thoughts and impressions. The tom cod abundance trend is exactly what I would have thought based on my fishing. And on the blue king crab, I think the adult crab are up on the sea pinnacles, and the trawl is only the younger crab are susceptible to the trawl. So I wonder about your age comp on the blue king crab. And then I guess one real question or thought I had was the Alaska nearshore current is kind of a pipeline from the Bristol Bay area right up into Norton Sound, and then beyond all the way north, Kotzebue Sound and so forth. Has anyone looked at the benthic or the trawl community in Norton Sound and contrasted it to further offshore, say by St. Lawrence Island? Is there a parallel, a mini Southern Bering Sea and Norton Sound community ways?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. First of all, in terms of the size class, the length frequency distribution that we're getting for blue crabs, and really for everything, yeah, our tool is limited in a lot of ways. It's limited in terms of the parts of the water column that it samples. It's limited in terms of the bottom types that we can sample on. And it's limited by its just overall size. There's just a lot of things that it doesn't catch very well. And blue king crab may be a good example of that, and certainly something like pollock is a really good example of that. When I show those length distributions where we see a big peak of 1-year-olds, and then we essentially really don't see pollock again until they're 4 or 5 years old. And the reason for that is because the 2 or 2, 3, 4-year-olds tend to be up higher in the water column in areas that we're not sampling with our net. And so we always have to be a little bit cautious with our interpretations of any of the length frequency distributions that we're seeing, because we have to be concerned about portions of the population that are just not susceptible available, we say, to our net and our survey gear. In terms of the benthic communities of Norton Sound versus the area more offshore, um, that seems like it would be best sampled with sort of something like a benthic grab or something like that, something that can really dig into that benthic invertebrate community of the things that are actually in the sediment, the polychaete worms, the bivalves that are digging, those sorts of things. And, that's another thing we don't tend to sample very well just because our net doesn't dig into the benthos very much. I know that Jackie Grebmeyer has done a lot of work out there with grabs like that and samplers that are more effective in looking at that community. I don't know if they've done much sampling in Norton Sound, though. I'm just not familiar enough with her work to know if that information exists or not.
Okay. Well, I just thought that might be okay.
Anything else, Charlie? You good?
I'm good. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for the question, Charlie.
All right. Any other questions? I know I have some. Oh, go ahead, Dean. I see your hand raised.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. Great job. I guess
Thanks.
my initial question is, you've shown on the order of 20 to 40 years of data, populations changing. There's always a high, there's always a low. When do you throw up a red flag that says, oh my gosh, this species is in trouble?
I guess some of that to me depends on what you mean by a red flag. You know, and the first thing that we always need to consider when we see population declines is, does that represent a real decline in the overall species population, or does that represent a change in the distribution of the species such that we're no longer sampling the same amount of that population? I've talked about that for a couple of different species, in particular the more coastal species, that for which there are probably different proportions of the overall population that are inside our survey area versus outside our survey area. We always have what we sort of internally refer to as the Russian issue, which means that there's always species moving back and forth across the Russian border, and we don't have really any good way to track those. Then there's the additional issue when you have warmer water, that species might be moving into deeper water to avoid that climate change. And we don't sample the upper slope in the deep water. So we always have to be concerned that what we're seeing is not necessarily a change in the population, overall population health or numbers, but a change in the population physical distribution. That's the first thing. And then the second thing to say is that it's not really the best way to put this is, it's not really our purview to be raising the red flags. We're not the assessment group. We have a different group of folks that do the assessment, and they're the ones who do the overall biomass estimates based on fishery independent data and other data sources, and they're the ones who set the quotas for the fishery species. And so they're the ones who interpret that in the Fishery Management Council process. So for us, our part of this whole matrix of scientific endeavor is to collect the data, and to collect the best data that we can, and to collect those data keeping in mind that we're not sampling the whole population for any of these species. I hope that somewhat
a
answers
good
your question.
example, though, for me is the influx of pea cod over the last several years into the Northern Bering Sea has to have a major impact on the benthos. And again, the cold pool reforms, and that kind of goes away for a while, but it's going to be a trend. And I'm just curious about things like that. And, if you could throw up a red flag and say, oh my gosh, pea cod are coming north, something's going to happen.
Yeah, well, certainly, that many Pacific cod in the Northern Bering Sea in back in 2017, 2018, they were eating something. And whether they were, the food resources that they were depending upon were ephemeral food resources or food resources that were just there because of the warm water, like the cod themselves were, or whether, those were populations that existed in the Northern Bering Sea before and were hammered by the cod when they were here. We're not really sure about that. But yeah, for sure, when there's even a short-term invasion of a large population of particularly predatory fish like Pacific cod, they're going to be eating a lot of stuff.
Does that help you, Dean?
It does,
know
thanks. It does.
Yeah. The nice thing, I think one of the best things I see of the race division is they have to generate the data, and all those kind of like managerial questions, those are going to the different place. And then they all get hashed out at that council, I think.
Yeah, the regional office does some of that, and then we have a stock assessment group that handles that stuff, and it's all hashed out at the council meeting.
Right. So, but you did touch on one of my questions, and that is for all the different, you're looking in the stomachs and things like that of many of these fish and the other things you're catching. Was any of the diet abnormal, or did the diet for what you do look in, are things eating what they should for the most part? Do you know that?
Yeah, I'm unfortunately not terribly familiar with the newest diet data. There's definitely a time lag between when we collect the stomachs and when they're analyzed and when the data come out. So yeah, I'm not overly familiar with the recent information on that, and it'll probably be another year or so before we fully know what that information is.
Okay, because it's nice to know they're there. It's another thing, are they eating what they should? So that's another one. Go ahead, Dean. I see your hands back up.
Hey, I don't mean to be a thorn in your side. One thing I noticed is you haven't shown any salmonid data, but you have shown herring data. And a lot of the salmon coming up the rivers have shown a lot of ichthyophonus, which has been related to the herring. Is there any way you can sample your herring sample for ichthyophonus?
First of all, about the salmon, the reason that I don't present salmon data is we catch the number of salmon that we catch in the Northern Bering Sea every year, I can count on one hand. It's a very, very small number. They just outswim our net, and we don't sample them very well at all. Even in the Southern Bering Sea, we get very, very few salmon. We have not sampled herring at this point for ichthyophonus. I'm not sure that I believe there was some historical work on that, but I'm not sure there were any conclusions to be drawn from that. So I think we have done some of it in the past, but it's not an ongoing area of research right now.
I would love you to connect with some of the salmon people up the Yukon with ichthyophonus and see if you could perhaps sample herring for ichthyophonus. But I think you guys are doing a great job. I know you're overtaxed, but thank you for your presentation.
Thanks. Yeah, ichthyophonus and herring. All right, I'll look more into that and see what the history of that is and whether we have any information on that. And if so, I'll try to pass it along.
All right. Anyone else? I've got a lot of questions. Oh, go ahead, Wes.
Good evening, and thanks much for the presentation. Duane, I was just wondering about your thoughts in that, like the last several years with you're saying that the pollock and cod have moved back farther south. How would you say our side is relating to the Russian side? And part of the reason is like the Russians had a significant number of fish.
That's
I mean,
the one I
boats in a significant number number of boats, like 6 or to 8 trawlers in the Chukchi this year from the end of July clear into the end of October. And so I was curious if you had any thoughts about that, and how may the Chukchi be being used by fish that are going into the Northern Bering Sea and then back farther south. Just some of your thoughts from all your survey work there would be really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, we certainly know that there are Russian boats fishing in the Chukchi, and they wouldn't be there if they weren't catching some fish. So we know there are pollock on that side of the Chukchi, and yeah, and it's foolish to think there aren't pollock on the American side of the Chukchi as well. We just haven't really been up there to take a look at it in quite some time. But the other thing is that we have recently got one of the things that we did several years ago was when we were out near the Russian border in the Eastern Bering Sea, we put out a couple of these upward looking sonar. Um, uh, I don't know what they're called, sonar devices that were basically like a sounder pointed downward, only they were pointed upward to look at how much fish biomass was moving back and forth across the Russian border. And what they found was it's a lot more movement going across the Russian border in the Bering Sea than we thought it was. There are a lot of fish moving back and forth between the two areas, and we're not really sure what that means in terms of uh, where the population's going, and how many of the fish that go that way aren't coming back, and how many of their fish that come this way aren't going back. And so there's really a lot left to do there. But it's the intriguing thing is that there's, I guess, what some of us have suspected for a long time, there's a lot of movement across that border in the Bering Sea as well. And probably a lot more, that's probably a lot more of a consideration for the overall population of pollock in the Bering Sea than, say, the fish that go into the Chukchi. I suspect that there's a lot more back and forth across the different, the border in the Bering Sea than there are going into the Chukchi.
Yeah, thank you. That is very helpful when we're thinking about the movement of fish north and south, but east and west likely being very much more important at this juncture. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
All right. Any other questions? I know that I had to sort of pick my jaw up off the floor when you said no survey. It sounds like no surveys until 2027 for the Northern Bering Sea. And what?
That long?
That's not we're not thinking that long.
Will you come back in 25?
Yeah. So what we're
Okay.
anticipating is that the original schedule that we were thinking about when we started these surveys in 2017 was an every other year schedule. And that's probably what we're going to get back to, is an every other year schedule. But we're hoping that what we can do by 2027 is have a full redesign of the survey so that we don't have an Eastern Bering Sea and a Northern Bering Sea and a Bering Sea slope survey. We just have one Bering Sea survey that covers the whole region. So the plan is that although for the next few years we might be doing an every other year Northern Bering Sea survey, by 2027 we'll be sampling the Northern Bering Sea, the Eastern Bering Sea, and parts of the Bering Sea slope every year continuously.
In the Chukchi? No?
Well,
Find out what the story is up there.
We're not there yet.
Okay,
we're not there yet
that's all right.
in terms of funding, but it's something that's on our radar, and it's something that we're starting to plan for.
Okay.
And we've been planning for a couple of years. The funding is just not there yet.
Right. I mean, you just wonder. We see so much. There were up to 8 commercial fishing vessels in the Chukchi, and they were fishing south central Chukchi. They were fishing southwest Chukchi, and you wonder what. And we're seeing differences with the marine mammals, like there's sea lions still pretty far north right now. So, and so if you're not going to be here the survey won't occur next year in 24.
That is the potential that we're looking at right now, just because having time to do both
Okay.
the Northern Bering Sea and all of that survey modernization work that we need to do. It's impossible to do both.
Okay, so you guys provide us so much information, and you're doing such a comprehensive look at the Northern Bering Sea offshore. We're behind with our ice production. We're about to get 2 lows back to back. One certainly will bring us a big push from the south, elevated water, things like that. That's going to happen starting in on Saturday night. So late Saturday night.
Yeah, that's what I thought too.
Yeah, look at the National Weather Service or windy.com there, Orland. It's a big one. So with that coming, with the lack of ice we have right now, the southerly storm we're going to have with some strength, our ice is probably not, we are in an El Nino, and Rick Toman did a Strait Science on the 26th of October, letting us know that we have for an El Nino year, for the Northern Bering Sea, we have an Bering Strait region, we have an 81% chance of being warmer than normal. Given that, I wonder about the strength of next year's cold pool, given the odds that are coming at us. If you are not here to sample and give us what the results of this warm water that may happen to us, that could be potentially quite impressive, then what can we do to tell you? Do you want us to report to you about the strange fish, or that we sort of do? Do you want a continuation of that? Are those public reports that we're able to give you from the region if you are not here with your gear? Is that helpful, or are there anything you would like us to do?
Of course, yeah, that information is always helpful and always interesting. Even if we're not in the Northern Bering Sea next year, we will be able to, I think, get a pretty good handle on what the cold pool is doing, and because most of the area of the cold pool that we sample every year is further south in the Eastern Bering Sea, and it's in that slightly deeper water. So I think we'll still have a pretty good idea of, hopefully based on the previous years of sampling that we've done in the Northern Bering Sea, we'll have a pretty good idea of what's going on there by what we see further south, because we have
Okay.
enough years of data now to string together that I think we'll be able to make some inferences about what's happening there. But yeah, that information, from the villages, from what's washing up on the beaches, from the weird stuff that people are seeing and can't identify. I've always said that identifying weird fish from photos is one of the most interesting and fun parts of my job. I spent a lot of time in a sort of a previous position working with observers, and they would always send me their weird photos of fishes. And one of the fun parts of my job was trying to identify those fish. And aside from just the fun and interesting part of trying to figure out what those things are, it really does tell us about what's happening there when we can't be there. So yes, that information is
All
always
right.
very useful.
Well, we'll try to make sure you're getting the reports as they come. And your answer is spoken like a true fish biologist. You're very interested to get, that's the fun part of your job, getting all these pictures to ID. Go ahead, Dean. We see your hand up.
Yeah, so since you're kind of reconstructing the evaluation of the survey, I would be very impressed if you could add as capelin and saffron cod to those samples that you end up sending to Kathy LaFay for
Okay.
major vectors of harmful algal blooms, because those guys are the ones that graze and pass it on to the rest of the environment. And I would just love to see that kind of data collected somewhere, whether you collect the data and send it on to Kathy and let her take care of it. I don't care, but HABs are an important issue in that area.
Gay, have you guys done any analysis of HAB toxins in fishes yet?
That is one for Kathy to answer.
Okay.
Yeah, I've sent her salmon intestine, salmon GI tracts and whatnot, but I haven't seen her whole presentation on the results. But that'll be forthcoming. And Dean, there is a process for us to ask for those samples, so I'll ask Kathy about adding those on to the Trawl survey. It's a good idea.
Yep.
And so that you're aware, Duane, that the harmful algal bloom that the Bering Strait from St. Lawrence Island to actually all the way up north of Shishmaref, southern Chukchi, experienced in 22 was the most persistent, toxic, and massive bloom of Alexandrium, which produces saxitoxin, which can give you paralytic shellfish poisoning, known as PSP, ever recorded in U.S. waters. So we went big on that, and that is why harmful algal blooms are a very difficult topic, and we're all learning together, and we're trying to make sure we get a good understanding of what's happening, because it's a serious topic. So thank you for mentioning that. And I forgot to mention, you guys do give samples from your trawl surveys to that effort, and it's very much appreciated to learn how much saxitoxin is wending through the food web of the Northern Bering Sea. So thank you again for that.
Yeah, and so far it's only invertebrates, but yeah, if it would be helpful for Kathy to request some of those fishes, then we could do that as well.
Okay, it's been super. She's been focused on walruses, and it's super duper that you can get those clams offshore when you're able, as well as I think there's some invertebrate marine worms as well, but those clams are fantastic. Trying to get at some of the risks or loads that the animals like bearded seal, like beluga, like walrus that are feeding on those might be ingesting. So it's a big one. All right. Anyone else? Any other questions? If not, I did have a question. Since you're on, Orlin, the one thing that caught me off guard about this whole talk, other than the fact that we may not see the bottom trawl survey occur next year, is, what was it you said? There's a huge increase of the sea peach, the UPA, right? You said it was quite dramatic increase in the numbers you saw, the sea peach. So
Really?
He said it was like, what was your numbers there, Duane?
I want to say it was 10 times this year what we saw last year.
Wow.
10 times.
I missed that part.
I know. I thought you were going to say something about it, because I will, because he did say that the sea onion, I don't know the Yupik name, but it's the stem.
Yeah. Oh no, that's what they are. Sea onion. The first time.
Yeah. He said those had gone down, but the UPA had gone up. And I was like, my ear went up. Holy cow, because everyone's been complaining, where are they? Why is it so few? It's okay. You lost the share, but that's okay. You can just tell us about it. That's okay.
So maybe the next strong north winds, maybe
we'll find out. We'll be able to maybe confirm their findings, huh?
Oh, cool.
And
but it's true that we saw 10 times as many this year as we saw last year.
Wow.
And so that overall estimate of the population from the Northern Bering Sea this year is almost back up to what we saw in 2017. And they're still not the kind of thing that we see everywhere. They're still just in small pockets that we see them. But yeah, certainly a lot more pockets this year than there were last year.
So we're about to have a big low pressures too, one from the south, and then we're supposed to have another big, it's going to bring some big waves. And I don't know, we had Rick Toman on here for a bit, but I think he jumped off. And I think we might be getting some north winds in that second storm. Not sure. Let us know what you find on the island. Maybe this will be a good chance. I hope it pans out for everybody to make a good harvest.
Yeah, I was supposed to get some samples for oh my god, what's her name within SHC?
Emma Pate,
yeah.
Yep.
Maybe with that storm coming in, we'll have some stuff wash up and all get them together, and we'll send it out.
Yeah, if there's 10 times the norm, what you guys have been doing, there might be enough to spare for a sample. So
Yeah.
Taking one off the plate. So that's very much appreciated. And she and I are working together on that harmful algal bloom issue. So it's very awesome that you've got that in your mind. She will very much appreciate those samples.
Yeah, sounds
Windy forecasts next Wednesday, strong north winds on the island.
All right,
Wednesday. Okay.
Wednesday.
Yeah.
A quick announcement for everybody. There is no Strait Science next week. We had a cancellation at the last minute, but the next, and then we have Thanksgiving. The next Strait Science will be on the 30th of November. It's going to be about microplastics. There was a student that was doing a project with the seals harvested in this region, and she was looking at microplastics in the, and I didn't know about it. So I just found out about it and sort of chased her down and said, please let us know what you found. She was looking at the stomach contents of seals harvested in the Bering Strait region, and she was looking for the presence in their stomachs of little tiny pieces of plastic. So she has her project presentation, and she will be giving that on the 30th of November. I'm almost afraid to ask what she found, but we need to know it, and we'll see
Yes.
what the plastics are in the in our seals that were harvested in this region. So I really wanted to catch that one. The other is to sort of save the date, April 2nd to 4th here in Nome. UAF Northwest Campus and Alaska Sea Grant are hosting the Western Alaska Interdisciplinary Science Conference, known as WASC, and that will be the 2nd through 4th of April. We are saving the 5th potentially for a workshop, and we're working on ideas for that, but we wanted to let you know you'll start seeing some advertising for that, and we're hoping, I think that'll be a very good conference, and it'll be post Iditarod and pre-birders. So that's where it's tough for, if you want to come in and you're wanting to be out on the water the first week of April, but for the rest of us, that's what the dates are going to be for that. With that, any other questions? Wonderful presentation, Duane and Lyle. If you guys want to stay on for a sec, we'll say goodnight to everybody, and we'll see you next time. Stay safe, everybody, with the incoming weather this weekend.
Yep.